have pioneered the use of same-language subtitling on Bollywood film songs on TV for mass literacy in India. He laid the foundation for the SLS project as an associate professor at the Indian Institute of Management at Ahmedabad, IIMA, in its Center for Educational Innovation. Currently, he is the president of Planet Read, a nonprofit involved in scaling SLS efforts in India and other countries, and the CEO of Bookbox, Inc., a for-profit social venture producing children's animated stories in more than 25 languages. Bridge was elected an Ashoka Fellow in 2004 and recognized as Indian Social Entrepreneur of the Year and a Schwab Foundation Fellow in 2009. Planet Read won the inaugural 2013 International Prize for Literacy from the Library of Congress. Please join me in welcoming Bridge Kothari.
Thanks. Well, thank you all. Actually, it's a real honor to be back here at Stanford. I spent a year here on a fellowship. That fellowship is no more, but it was a really nice fellowship. It was called the Reuters Digital Vision Fellowship Program, which allowed social entrepreneurs to come and explore new directions. So actually, one of the projects that spun off from our work was born here at Stanford. So I'm delighted to be back. Okay. Well, we took on this challenge of how do you make 1 billion people read in India every day? And I mean that seriously. It's not just like a vision statement that, oh, 1 billion, anybody can throw 3 billion or something. I really mean how do you get 1 billion people reading every day? And that's the challenge that I'm going to talk about. Okay. India has made impressive strides in literacy. As you can see, from a literacy rate of 18.3% at the time of independence to now about 74%, and more recently it's gone to about 77% or almost 80%. So that's pretty good progress. So it's really only about 20% left, right? How many of you think it's only about 20% left? Okay, so there's some tension here, right?
तो हमारे टीचर है ना क्लास पढ़ाते हैं तो ऐसा ही लिखा के क्लास में ऑफिस में जाके बैठ जाती है और नाश्ता करती है.
Okay, so that's the story of a lot of literate people. She's actually counted as literate. Okay, it's in class 8 and cannot read basic simple texts at class 1 level. But her story, if you look at it, points certainly to the low quality of teaching across India, in the villages especially. Teacher absenteeism, she mentioned that. She can decode some letters. So she's not completely illiterate either. I don't think we can call her literate, but she's not completely illiterate either. She's sort of got off the block. But she can't read a newspaper or simple books. So it's sort of, she's literate for the government, but there's a problem. She can't really do anything with that skill. No good content in her own language to read. So that's a big challenge, right? How do you get people in India, and a very, very multilingual country, 22 official languages and 1,000 dialects, right? How do you get people to have access to reading material in their own language? Okay. Now, here's a macro picture of the problem. This is a survey that's done by Pratham's Asar group, and what they've been finding is that year after year, they've been testing class 5 children. And what they found is that even in class 5, which means after 5 years of primary education, about 53% cannot read a class 2 text. A class 2 text is the headline of a newspaper, really. At least you should be able to read that. But after 5 years, this is a big problem. So we are adding year after year, roughly 53% of our children who are coming out of class 5 into the pool of youth and adults who are going to remain non-readers, but we'll call them literate. Okay? So what we did is we did this census survey. What the census does is goes to every household and asks people who is literate here. And the head of the household typically lists down all the people who are literate. Okay? That tends to over-report, because as soon as somebody is in class 1, they tend to get reported as literate. Right? So what we did is we did 2 methods. We did the census method, which is basically give them a, versus a reading method. So in the reading method, this is the paragraph that they would read. And in the census method, they would just report, self-report. So here's what we found, and here's the huge challenge, and this is the discrepancy between the government's data and what civil society organizations like ours are finding, is that when we did just purely the census method, we found roughly exactly what the government would have found, which is 68 or 69% who are roughly considered to be literate or self-reported as literate. But when you start adding the reading method, which is really just read a simple paragraph at class 1 level or class 2 level, we start finding that it's split into 3 colors, green, yellow, and red. And you start seeing that in the middle is this large, almost 27% who are neither here nor there. And even if you add up the readers and the weak readers, you'll still get to about 53%. So it's still a good exaggeration, almost a 16–17% exaggeration on the literacy figures, right? So there's a big problem. In terms of large numbers, this is we extrapolated that finding to what would it mean at the level of the country. And so what we find is that 273 million people in India above the age of 7 are definitely illiterate, and here's where the government and we agree. We also agree on 311 million people who can actually read. And it matches very well with the circulation of newspapers and magazines. Generally, about 300 million people in India are considered to be readers. But there's this large section, 470 million, very large, which is semi-literate. And the government calls them literate, and we call them semi-literate. So our work is targeted at the yellow zone. How do we get this large mass of people, 470 million, to become good readers and get into the green zone? And of course, every year we're adding many, many more from the red zone to the yellow zone. Okay, we also drew inspiration from this simple notion that a butterfly's wings flapping in Brazil can set off a tornado in Texas. Okay, and we owe that to that idea to Professor Lawrence, and that's the essence of chaos theory. So the question is there a butterfly for literacy? Is there something small somewhere, a small perturbation that can cause those 470 million people to practice reading and actually get into the green zone? The opportunity is here. We have today about 750 million, and in fact probably more now, but certainly 750 million people in India with access to television already. Okay? And so in 1996, when of course the access to television was much less, we had this idea of same language subtitling, which essentially means what you hear is what you read. And will that make a big difference to literacy? Okay? The way it happened was I was a student here in Ithaca, and a bunch of us were watching a movie in Spanish. And some of you may have heard of this movie, Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown, by Pedro Almodovar. Anyone here who has seen it? Okay. Others, go see it because it's hilarious. Okay? And I think it won an Oscar too. But it's really a great movie. In any case, those were the VHS tape days. And the movie came with English subtitles on Spanish dialogue. And we were all students of Spanish, and we wanted to try and catch the dialogue, but they just spoke so fast that all of us were getting a little, in fact, quite a bit lost in that process. So the thought at that point was, well, why don't they just put Spanish subtitles on Spanish cinema, at least on VHS? And perhaps we'll catch the dialogue better. And so we got talking about it, and some of us agreed, yeah, it might actually help us get the conversation better. And it was almost like a coffee table kind of discussion. And then I said, well, maybe India will become literate if they just subtitle Hindi film songs in Hindi. It's a very casual thought. And of course, somebody said, oh, maybe there is something to this, right? So fine, I finished my research and my PhD, and then I got this job in India. So the first thing I explored was this basic, simple idea that can it actually work? That was in 1996. And to my surprise, firstly, that it was such a simple idea, yet it had not been explored. So I really scanned the literature to see this must have been tried. What I found was that it was tried for language learning. What I found is that it was same language subtitles were used for media access among the deaf, essentially closed captioning. We are all familiar with that. But for literacy, it had not been tried. Right? So then we started the research process. Anyway, here's the idea of same language subtitling. I just want you to see it in a few Indian languages. So this is in Tamil. Okay, so you get the idea. Word for word, what you hear is what you read. Well, you all know it as karaoke, right? Essentially, mainstreaming karaoke on television. Now, if you think about karaoke, where is karaoke really practiced? In Japan. Where? In Japan or any country where? In bars. For whom? For whom? Yes? Drunk people? Yes, that's a good answer too. But drunk people who can read or can't read. There's always this thing, right? Karaoke is essentially conceptualized as something for the literate, right? So that was a slight difference. Okay. So it was first implemented, same language subtitling in Gujarat state. In fact, the current Prime Minister, have you been following the recent developments? Okay. So we have a new Prime Minister who happens to be from the state of Gujarat. So it was first implemented there. Over time, over time means really about 12 years, right? It came to different parts of the country, but only one program per week in that language. And you may know that India is divided along linguistic lines, each of the states. So each state has its own language, regional language, but again spoken by 20 million, 50 million, 70 million, in some cases 100 million and more people. But only 30 minutes a week. Now that's not a lot, right? So even though the footprint looks very impressive, the entire country is now getting this, actually it's only about half an hour a week is what we were able to do in all of those languages, Hindi, Telugu, Bengali, Kannada, and so on. We've had a lot of supporters of this project, and they're all listed there. But I will add something that all of the supporters of at least our work, and I think this is generally true of a lot of people who pursue social innovation, and is that support generally comes for a year to 2 years, okay? And this is a big problem, at least from people sitting on this side who are really trying to get some social innovation in policy, is that you almost have to run from pillar to post every 2 years. It's very rare for midterm to long-term support, and maybe there are a few organizations that are lucky, but certainly our experience has been that it's always, even good ideas will be supported for 2 years, and then the assumption is that, well, if it's that good, somebody else should take it up also, okay? But even half an hour a week, about 200 million weak readers are getting practice in each of these languages. Not in each of these languages, the total of these languages, about 200 million people. Okay. So this is on a Sunday morning, people just watching television huddled around. So it's never you know, just 1 or 2 people watching. A lot of times it's just community viewing. And on a Sunday morning, they're hopefully reading along, right? I don't know that, right? That was the research question. Okay, now that is our best case scenario. So I will admit that not everybody so visually and so openly sings along. But when we catch that, of course, it makes for a good presentation. But is it really going on in people's minds, even if they're not lip reading it? And that's what we explored later. But just to give you a sense of what people say is happening, okay? Are they watching, or are they watching the visuals, which is, of course, Bollywood, so clearly it's not easy to, you know, get your eyes off of, you know, these amazingly attractive actors, right? And go to reading. Are they doing it? So this is what this response. Okay?
लिखा हुआ पढ़ ले तो अच्छा लगता है। अच्छा, और कोई बात अच्छी लगी इससे, उससे क्या फायदा हो सकता है बताइए? इससे गाना लिखना हो तो लिखा जाएगा। गाना लिखना हो तो लिखा जाएगा। अच्छा, तो आप लिखेंगे बैठ के गाना? अच्छा, नहीं अच्छी बात कही। और कोई बताइए कुछ? ये बताएंगे। इससे कम सुनाई देता है वो पढ़ सकता है। इससे कम सुनाई देता है वो पढ़ सकता है।
Okay, so people certainly read, and they don't entirely read all the time. They're, of course, ignoring the subtitles sometimes, but they read enough times that it possibly gives them reading practice. Now, in the second clip, you saw how different reasons were given for why it might be useful. One of them was that people want to write down the lyrics of the song. So even though it started off as a reading project, the question was then, well, if people are writing down the lyrics, or if the reading is improving, does it also lead to writing skill improvement, right? And the media access among the deaf was also mentioned. So there are many, many different angles to subtitling that slowly we became aware of as we went along in the project. Now, to answer the first question, really people, are they ignoring the subtitles or not? So one of the things we did is that we did some eye tracking research to see, so to your left is a weak reader watching a Bollywood song without the subtitles, and to your right is the same person watching the same song with the subtitles. And you start seeing that wherever they're looking on the screen, of course that's what the eye tracker measures, is plotted there, you start seeing that actually there are two distinct bands on the right. Is that proof of reading? Anyone? Yeah.
Not necessarily. They could just be looking at the red line going past the...
Exactly, exactly. So even if a bird kind of flew once in a while on the subtitle band, you would probably find that people are looking at that part of the screen. But at least we know that they're not ignoring the subtitles. Okay? But we don't know if they're reading. We don't even know if they can read because it could be too fast, just like we experienced with that Spanish film. Okay, so the question was, of course, does it lead to reading skill improvement? So we did this study, and the baseline was set way back in 2002. And about 5 years later, we actually went and remeasured the same person with the same reading tool. Okay? And this data was collected by an independent agency across 5 states, Hindi-speaking states. And we compared people who watched this program, Rangoli, which had the Hindi subtitles, with people who just didn't watch that program, and everyone having access to television. Okay, so on that socioeconomic front, they were pretty comparable. And some of the tests that we did was just very, very simple decoding tests, like can you identify these letters? Can you read these 2-syllable words? Then a little bit more complicated words, which have sort of half a syllable used. And then, of course, can you vowelize in your language, right? So we did it in Hindi. So I won't spend too much time on the reading part, but just to give you this detail in which we actually measured reading skills. So here's what we found. Okay? What we found is that, for example, children who were completely illiterate at the beginning in 2002, who could not read a single letter. Okay? After 5 years, what happened to them? So we found that about 25% remained completely illiterate, which means even after 5 years of education, they couldn't identify or read a single letter. That is shocking. About 50% were able to read a few of the letters, okay? Maybe roughly 5 to 20 letters, okay, out of the 40. And about 24% could read all the letters. And then, of course, we did the other exercises also. But basically, 24% only are becoming good readers. It is very similar to the earlier statistic I showed to you from USSR. Now, and those children just got schooling. They didn't watch the programs. Now, to the right, similar group of children going to school, but at home watching these songs with subtitles in their own language. So here's what we found, that the red zone has shrunk to less than half. Okay? So we're definitely putting more children up into the yellow zone. But we're pushing so many more people from the yellow zone to the green zone. So you have, we've literally more than doubled the number of children who are becoming good readers, simply because for 5 years they had this exposure. They go to school, they learn a little bit to read, perhaps, but they go home and that skill gets practiced that same very night for 10 minutes, perhaps. Right? That kind of interaction is what's causing this kind of doubling of good readers among primary school children. Does it impact writing skills? Okay. Here's what we found. At the baseline, more or less similar. After about 5 years, we find, again, this difference, right? We ask them, write any 5 words that you can from your own context. So we're not biasing that maybe you don't know these words that we've decided to test. Write any 5 words from your context. And we found that those who got exposure to same language subtitling, about 72% could write 5 words. And those who did not, about 45% could write 5 words, right? We tested that again with, can you write your complete address? This is a common test in literacy in India, where they're asked to write their complete address, including the village, the district, the state, whatever, so that a letter can reach you. And again, we found very similarly, those who got exposure to same language subtitling on the extreme right, about 56% could write their address, but as compared to only about 34% of the children who actually couldn't, who didn't see those songs with the subtitles. So big difference just purely because the subtitles existed. Now, it worked with children. Did it work with adults also? Again, it's a very similar graph to the children. Now, you find on the left, at the baseline, we took a sample of extremely weak readers, right? So about 83% basically couldn't read a single letter. But you see on the right, that has come down to 68%. So it's not as dramatic as the children, obviously, because adults are slower learners when it comes to reading. But you find that the green zone has also made a significant shift from 3% to 12%. So it's a much slower progress. So now imagine if this exposure had gone on for 10 years, what would the results be? We don't know that, but you can certainly at least have a theory around that, that perhaps a little bit more exposure for a few more years perhaps will also push many, many more people into the yellow and green zone. And as you saw, because children lapped it up, and this is some it's a classic graph. It's the Heckman graph that shows that the earlier you make these kinds of educational interventions in preschool, in school, you are going to actually reap much more of the rewards of that every dollar that you spend. So, but the challenge, for example, in a country like India is that when we think of illiteracy, we think of, oh, youth and adults who are illiterate. So we make the intervention up there, not realizing that you probably need to make the intervention in preschool, not necessarily subtitling, okay? In fact, I wouldn't even recommend that for preschool children. But you need to make certain preschool interventions so that when they come to school, they are school ready. And in school, if they are getting, even if they're getting somewhat of a low quality of education, if they're getting reading outside of school, you will get them to read by class 5. Almost every system that works ensures that children are reading by class 3, actually. But certainly in a developing country like India and many other countries, class 5, I would advocate, is a point where you have to make sure that every child almost can read, unless they have, of course, a learning disability, which is a different matter altogether. But most children should be able to read by class 5. Okay. Does it lead to other forms of reading? Because obviously we don't want people to stop with Bollywood, right? And its limited vocabulary. What we find is that the first thing people do is pick up a newspaper once they become readers. So at the baseline in 2002, we found that those who got exposure to subtitles and those who didn't get exposure to subtitles were pretty similar in their reporting of how many times a week do they read a newspaper. In fact, we asked them, do you read a newspaper at least once a week? And so what we found is about 34% in both groups said that. But in 2007, after 5 years, we found, again, this difference. Those who were exposed to the subtitles, about 70% said that, yes, they read a newspaper once a week. So again, a big, big difference. You'll see reports and newspaper articles talking about the press boom in India, right? And very easily it's attributed to, oh, it's growing literacy, that's why. Well, literacy has been growing since independence, we saw, but a lot of those literates cannot read. Actually, we're almost making a claim that the fact that we're pushing a lot of the quote-unquote literates now to actually be able to read is causing that kind of revolution in reading as well. So this simple intervention on television can actually have a big impact on newspaper reading. Okay, so when a good thing gets going, some other good things start happening. Is actually the ratings went up of the programs. And it was so obvious to us actually from day one, because what we did was we went to the villages, we went to railway stations, we went to bus stops. We just set up 2 televisions with the exact same song playing. One had the subtitles and one did not. And we just asked people, which one do you like? And almost everybody said, no, we like this one because we can sing along, we can know the lyrics, and there are many reasons why we like the songs with the subtitles. So we went to the television producers and the networks and said that, hey, you know, people are saying actually they like this even. Would you mind just adding it? And and almost invariably the response was, really? We don't think so, and we know so that people won't like this. It'll ruin the visual pleasure of watching these songs with the subtitles. So we know, because you guys are not television people, and we are. So that's when I realized that actually nobody knows. Nobody knows. Even the experts really think they are experts, but sometimes if it's a new idea, they just don't know. And it was interesting for us that more than 90% people said we want the songs with the subtitles. So this is reflected in the ratings. About 15 to 20% the ratings actually went up on different programs that we subtitled. This was also independently verified by a private channel, Z Television, which actually looked at the same movie telecast with the songs without subtitles and the same movies telecast with subtitles, and they compared wherever the subtitles actually came, the ratings went up. So it's independently verified that actually it's popular with viewers. And the reason why that happens is that when people are watching, they tend to stay longer with the song because the lyrics are there and they want to know the lyrics. So, and ratings is a function of the number of people who watch and the time that they watch that program. Okay. Cost is a big reason why we're doing this, and you know, in a country that has limited resources sometimes for these social programs. If you look at it, the math is very simple. We spend about $20,000 on 52 episodes, which means once a week that program will come with subtitles, right? $20,000. If in Hindi, it reaches about 100 million people. So that comes to a ridiculous number like $0.0002 per person per year. Okay? If you want to look at it another way, you multiply that by 65, okay, because that's the average age of a person in India, or even 70 if you want, the average age of a person, and you'll get to a figure of $1. So for $1, you can basically get one person to read for life every day. That's pretty inexpensive, I think. And typically, you'd budget about $3 per person per year in traditional programs. Now, it was mentioned that it's good for the deaf and hard of hearing. And we did some surveys, and yes, we confirmed that. So I just want to show you a clip of two deaf girls singing along to the subtitles. Okay, so you can see she's lagging behind on the audio, but she's reading along. Now, where are we in terms of the challenges, really? Our ask is very simple, that all the songs in the country, in all the 22 official languages, and even more if there are dialects that are being for which there are songs, just subtitle all of them in the same language on mainstream television. Not as an option, just do it. Because people like it anyway, right? And you will see a huge ripple in terms of literacy. It's good for, of course, media access among the deaf, which is by itself a good enough reason to actually do it. And that's why closed captioning was born here. I mean, it was to make media accessible to the deaf. It also, there's enough evidence and research that it's good for language learning. So this is very well established that people do all kinds of combinations. If you're learning French, you see it with French movie with English subtitles, sometimes English movie with French subtitles. So there's a major combination, and all of that has been researched that is good for language learning. Of course, it's good for the television networks also, right?
Same language subtitle doubles the number of functional readers among primary school children. A small thing that has a staggering impact on people's lives.
Okay, so essentially he explained that graph I showed you about the children improving and doubling the number of functional readers. So we were, of course, very thrilled that President Clinton talked about this. As you know, he's the explainer-in-chief, right? So he does it so succinctly and perfectly. So this is our marketing, by the way. So to go back to that question, is there a butterfly for literacy? Essentially an extremely simple something that happens somewhere that can cause a big reading storm somewhere else, right? I think there is one. Does it work in other countries? Will it work in other countries? Will it work here? You may have to give people a choice to turn it off. Okay? But the question is there any country today where songs are not popular on television in their own language? It doesn't have to be Bollywood, of course. Hope not. But they will have their own songs in East Africa, in Swahili. I mean, you could go on and on in different languages. South Asia is clearly in Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. You could have this. I'm sure in many countries, including pockets here, where there is a literacy challenge, but people watch a lot of music and consume it. Right? Okay? All right. Why did I show you this now? Because the World Cup is just about to begin. This was from 4 years ago, okay? How many million people have watched this song on YouTube? 600. As of today. As of today. If you guessed it, perfect. As of today, 670 million people actually have watched this song. Now, Shakira has also just launched another song, World Cup song, this year. Has anybody seen the theme song this year? But there are several people who have launched it, so she's one of them. Olodum has launched also a great song. All of these songs are going to go up to 1 billion views, okay? They're right now at about 5 million, 7 million views. So I'm actually making a pitch to all of us here in this room. Can we all write to Shakira as a group or as individuals and tell her that, look here, all you got to do is just subtitle, at least you would have 1 billion people who would have read your song by the time the next World Cup comes along, right? So it's a powerful tool that we have, and I think we probably should write to FIFA. Of course, I wrote last time as an individual. Shakira didn't write back. But maybe as a group, it might work. And maybe a group from Stanford. This is your last class, I know, so you might not want to think too much about this. But perhaps there is an action point coming out of this sharing. OK. I'm going to just open it up to questions. And I have some more stuff and spin-off that I mentioned earlier that I could talk about. But let's just open it up for questions first. Yeah?
I wanted to ask you what are your challenges and how is the conversation going on with the networks and TV channels right now?
Yeah. So we're in our 18th year. That's sad. That something like this that was proven 10 years ago is still struggling to get policy to actually act on it. But I think that every government is slow to pick up. Okay? But you talked about specifically networks. Now, interestingly, at the beginning, we approached the networks thinking that the private sector will clearly pick it up because obviously private sector is as interested in social development as the government would be. Well, the private sector's lens, at least in India for the networks, I found to be extremely narrow about, okay, how is it going to really affect my bottom line? Now, the ratings do go up. That wasn't enough to convince them that this will 10%. Well, you can always argue that it's because of something else, right? So the networks didn't really buy that. But for the social angle, I even made a pitch that, okay, assume that ratings don't go up. It's certainly not going to hurt you. That you agree? Yes, they said they agreed with that. But because of the social benefit, that wasn't enough. And I was a little disappointed in the private sector, to be honest, because it was a no-brainer for them. No loss, but huge gain for society. Why don't we do it? Finally, last year, we managed to get our first private sector partner in Zee Television. And Zee happens to have the largest collection of Indian language movies. So in all the movies, there are 5, 6 songs. So we subtitle those songs, right? So we scaled up in partnership with Zee in Maharashtra state. So that's the first network that actually came along. But it's a big one because that experiment has been going on for a year now. And it's pretty successful from their perspective, which is the ratings perspective. So I have a feeling that this has legs in the private sector. In the government, the challenge is different. They happily accept that literacy is a major goal for us. But the process of actually evaluating an innovation, understanding the science behind it, appreciating the data that's been collected, that I find is slow in the government. And then once the government is convinced that, okay, after 10 years that, okay, this might have some importance, then the question is, oh, but we don't have the money. Because this is a new idea, you don't have the money. If it's an old idea, you have the money. It's an allocated budget, right? So innovations often struggle with this, that there is no allocated money for. So one of the suggestions, at least I kind of make in my own polite way to government officials, is that perhaps every ministry in the government should have an innovation budget that you don't decide on. You have to get civil society experts, independent experts, to say, okay, this innovation budget is going to be allocated for these new ideas. Because if it goes back to the government officials deciding on the innovation budget, then we're back to square zero, right? Okay. Yeah.
It seems like from some of the videos that people don't necessarily see literacy as something that's very important for them. So do you think that it's something that almost like it's not necessarily an expectation, or they don't really see how it connects to the larger picture? Like, are you doing anything to address that?
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you a question. What sort of gave you that impression that people may not be interested in literacy? I'm curious. Yeah.
They didn't really connect it to anything larger than just understanding the lyrics of the shows they were watching.
Right. Okay. So I can understand why those limited clips might have given you that impression. What the reality is that almost every parent, children may not necessarily think of literacy as, you know, what even children here may not even understand what the importance of literacy is when they're 20 plus. Okay, but almost all parents will do anything to get their child to read. In fact, the first thing that they often what happens with parents do is that if they don't find a child really reading sufficiently, they actually pull them out of school, saying, well, you're not even learning to read now, so why are you there? Right? So there is that huge angst about it, that this is your ticket to success, and they know that. It's pretty powerful and deeply ingrained that people want their children to be reading. Yeah.
I have a question. Why songs? Have you ever tried making, like, for example, the entire movie, or like what have you found? Have you explored that option?
Yeah. So what we found is that, for example, all English movies in India are shown with English dialogue subtitled. And that's really, really good for India, because English language skills are going up tremendously in India. And we have to accept that English is a functional language, and it's a global language, and it gives you economic opportunities. So yes, in English that worked because, and the reason why the networks did it is because people were just not understanding the American and the British accents. It was difficult. So when they started putting the subtitles, people, it's almost the same reason why I appreciated, or I thought of having Spanish subtitles on a Spanish film. That seemed to have worked. Now, in Indian languages, all the viewers really speak that language really well. So they don't want the subtitles on the dialogue, because that's then distracting, right? If I put English dialogue on English movies here, all of you would rebel against it, because it does take away your attention. But if it was a language that you spoke partially, then you would want it. Or if there's an accent that you understood partially, then you would want the subtitles. In fact, news channels do this all the time. When they interview a global figure who perhaps speaks with an accent that is hard to understand for their viewers, what do? They put the same language subtitles. So the thumb rule that we've followed is that if the viewer has something beneficial from the subtitles, then it'll work. It could be media access, it could be understanding the accent, it could be reading along to songs, which I want to do because I enjoy singing along. I don't necessarily enjoy reading along to dialogue. In fact, a dialogue also I cannot anticipate. A song I can anticipate, right? So that's why dialogue is a little tricky. However, I would say that it might still work in India, and we would have to take it step by step and actually research that, and also see how viewers are reacting. If we lose even 40% of the viewers, we're dead, because the ratings will drop. Yeah. Yeah.
Building on that point, I've wondered, have any of the large companies looked at advertising at SLS?
They haven't, but it's an opportunity, because you do have in every song at least parts that are just purely music. And that could be, subtitling sponsored by, it's real estate that could be exploited by commercial agencies.
Sorry, I was more thinking, if Coca-Cola is doing an advert, that they subtitle that advert.
Oh, okay.
A way of getting companies to invest in the SLS and an additional to subtitling songs.
So it's interesting that at least in India, the ads often carry the subtitles in the same language. But they're more anywhere on the screen, so they make it more integrated with the visual. So if they say, new surf, so they'll have a star which has new surf written on it at the same time, right? So they do that kind of, so advertising does use it quite effectively and quite seamlessly, but they don't put it like, of course, like we're doing it. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Have you thought about how to address those segments of the population that still don't have access to television at home, for example, integrating in schools?
Yeah, it's a good question. And how do you reach people who don't have access to television? And that's a huge number. I mean, I said 750 million. So roughly about 250 million people don't have access to television. So it's a huge population. And we are not the people really to solve that problem, to be honest. And I would say that this is limited in that, from that perspective. But there is a desire to save up for television. So if there is economic progress, and there is sometimes, then people save up and buy a television. And sometimes it's the complexities that they don't have electricity in the village, right? So there are large pockets that actually this is not a solution for. But it's such an inexpensive solution that it actually frees up a lot of funds. So indirectly, you could probably target a lot of your resources to those groups where you actually need people to go personally and give them maybe small libraries is what's needed there. So I would say, yeah, so those kind of more grassroots approaches would work there better. Yeah. Yeah.
So
why the Indian government do not provide the educational program to the illiteracy person directly. So in my understanding, most of the TV, so in most of the countries, the governmental TV station provides some educational programs to the people, and it works to some extent usually. So,
yeah. So your question is whether government programs in education, do they work or not, or are they existing even on television? So when television first came to India, that was the big hope that television will now solve this problem of education, actually. So there were a lot of experiments done to see how you can have maybe a teacher come on television and teach a classroom of children who will come at the right time and leave at the right time. And you really don't need a teacher, right? Those are some of the kinds of experiments that were tried. They didn't work. Television primarily is seen as a medium of entertainment. Now, even today, there are a lot of government programs on education that are there. How many people really watch those programs? And they don't do an honest analysis of that, because once you do that, you'll realize that actually not a lot of people are watching. Perhaps you need more targeted, good quality programming that at least a few people will watch. But right now you have a standard machinery that is churning out programs that really very, very few people are watching. Our approach, that's why, was slightly different, that let's look at what people already watch, rather than solve that problem of creating content that will try and convince people to watch. So what we said was, well, if they're already watching certain genre of programming, if they're watching Discovery Channel, which they do actually quite a bit in India, perhaps there is education around that that can be built, National Geographic, that can be built. If they're watching a lot of Bollywood, we try to build something around that. Do they watch a lot of cricket in India? You bet, right? In the US, the children who watch baseball a lot, actually they're good at statistics. There's a link. So could we build a program on math and statistics, perhaps in a slightly entertaining way around cricket in India, right? So those are the kinds of things that at least we've tried to look at. Rather than impose a technology or content, we've tried to look at the technology that's already there and content that's already being watched.
We have time for one more question.
Okay. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about the actual process by which you went from the idea that you had in watching that film, whatever, 1996, in Ithaca, New York, to getting the programming introduced and tested in India? Did you do that as an individual? Did you create an organization? Was it just an India-based organization, or is there some component in the U.S.? Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Okay. So the process of from idea to where we are today. Just give you the milestones. The first bit was pure research. So 5 years, we just looked at, does it work? And once we had that confidence that it works, really, the data is there, we got some publications out in academic journals, then it was more like, okay, well, that's not going to be enough. Actually, I was naive to think that as a sort of a young academic, that I would write papers and the world would really do something with that. The world pretty much doesn't care for academic papers often in policy. Honestly, they don't, and they should. They should. So I don't want to demean that process, but I think that that process needs to be bridged, because you need that science and hard data, but that process then has to be taken to policymakers and be explained. Anyway, so to give you the milestones, so the research wasn't enough. So then it was more like, well, I got to pretty much take off the academic hat and put something else on, and other people started calling it a hat of social entrepreneurship. I didn't think of that, but that's what happened. And then I pretty much started doing this full time. That how do I get the government to move on this? And so the major steps was first facing a lot of resistance, but then winning global competitions helped, and then that brought the interest of the government of India in our work, because when we said that, look here, we're winning all these competitions around the world, for something as simple as this, maybe you should consider it. So finally, we managed to put it on national television in 2002. Remember, 1996 to 2002, that's a huge, huge gap. And then since 2002, we've been scaling up on different languages through foundation funding. So our strategy has been pretty much keep it alive at a certain steady state level as a pilot, as a pretty big pilot. Okay, 200 million people watching, but still on 10 programs a week only. And then keep knocking on the government of India's door to take it to the next, to the national policy level. So for example, in 2010 is when I was able to present this to the Broadcasting Corporation of India's board. They make the decision on this, whether the whole country will watch it or not. They loved it. And they pretty much told me, where were you all these years? And I was like, well, it's hard to get in front of all of you. Right? In any case, 2010 they heard, and we're 2014. So 4 years have gone by. They loved it. And 4 years have gone by. So there's again a problem there. So slowly, slowly working with the bureaucrats. And there are always bureaucrats that are actually sympathetic. But they all move on from having worked for, been in their position for 2 years, and then they move on. So you're always working with a new set of people. I think we're fortunate. I was telling Professor Litvak earlier that the current Prime Minister actually heard this entire presentation that I did today about 8 months back, when he wasn't even announced as a prime ministerial candidate. So we're lucky that he has heard it. So those are the kinds of steps that we've been taking. And then about creating the organization, we created Planet Read was born pretty much when I was here at Stanford for a year. And part of the fellowship was that they allowed us to incorporate a not-for-profit for as support from Stanford, actually. So we did that, and we took advantage of that. And we realized that once Planet Read was born here and in India as a not-for-profit, companies here actually got interested in contributing to our work. Google Foundation was one of them, one of the early ones, Dell later. So many foundations, and now USAID is supporting this kind of work. So Planet Read became a good conduit for that kind of support. But our goal is really not to build Planet Read into this huge organization. Our goal is to make same language subtitling policy. Planet Read will then go on and try to do it in other countries. But we want to scale it up in India and then use that as an example for other countries, which is much easier once you have a country the size of India actually accepting a solution like this, then other countries get interested. Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Let's give a very good
Thank you. Thank you.